Bear Creek was dying one drought at a time. A rancher in eastern Idaho watched his family's stream shrink every summer until the channel sat exposed and silent, cracked mud where water used to run, and he made a decision that every neighboring rancher thought was flat-out ridiculous. He petitioned the state to trap live beavers from a nuisance population 2 counties over and release them onto his land. 9 beavers went into a dying creek in the summer of 2015. What they built over the next 4 years rewrote everything the hydrologists thought they knew about drought, water storage, and the true cost of what America lost when it trapped out its beavers 150 years ago. The creek that was dying. Bear Creek runs cold and clear in spring. By late July, in drought years, it barely ran at all. The channel, which cuts through the high-elevation rangeland of Elmore County in southwestern Idaho, had been grazed hard for generations. Its banks were bare. The willows that once lined the water's edge had been eaten back to stubs or simply given up. The shade was gone. With the shade went the cool water. With the cool water went the fish. The stream had become what hydrologists call incised, meaning it had cut down into the earth so far that it sat below the level of the surrounding meadow. Water that should have seeped sideways into the floodplain was instead rushing straight downstream, stripping sediment, undercutting banks, and leaving the valley floor dry and cracked between storms. This was not a story unique to Bear Creek. It was the story of nearly every stream in the American Intermountain West. And to understand why, you have to go back to the fur trade. Before European trappers arrived in the early 1800s, the North American continent held somewhere between 100 million and 400 million beavers. That number carries so much weight, it is almost impossible to process. Every major watershed, from the Rockies to the Appalachians, was shaped by the work of animals that had been engineering water for nearly 20 million years. Beaver dams slowed rivers, raised water tables, grew meadows, and created the deep, cold pools where trout spawned. The great wetland meadows of the American West, the ones the first explorers wrote about with amazement, were in many cases beaver-built infrastructure that had been maintained continuously for thousands of years. Then came the beaver hats. Fashion, as it turns out, is a devastating ecological force. By the 1850s, beaver populations across the West had been nearly eliminated. The dams failed. The ponds drained. The meadows dried. The water tables dropped. And the rivers, freed from anything slowing them down, cut deeper and deeper into the landscape. Within a generation, the people living along those streams had no memory of what the valleys had looked like before. The incised channel, the exposed gravel bar, the dry meadow. These things started to look natural because nobody alive had seen anything different. In Idaho specifically, the damage compounded through the 20th century. Cattle grazing along stream banks removed the willows and sedges that stabilized the soil. Without root structure holding the banks, streams widened and shallowed. Water warmed. Native cutthroat trout and steelhead, which need cold, deep, slow pools to survive, retreated further upstream every decade. By the time Jay Wild inherited his family's ranch on Bear Creek, the stream had been declining for longer than anyone on the property could remember. The drought years just made it visible faster. The rancher nobody took seriously. Jay Wild is not a scientist. He runs cattle. He grew up on the ranch his family has worked since the 1950s, in the high sagebrush country south of Mountain Home, Idaho. He is not, by any description that fits neatly in a magazine profile, a radical. He wears the hat. He drives the truck. He has the opinions about government land management that you would expect from a fifth-generation rancher in Elmore County. But Jay Wild had a problem that cattle couldn't solve, and he was honest enough to admit it. Every summer, he watched the creek shrink. He watched the pasture along the stream go dry even when the surrounding range still had some grass. He watched the water temperature climb into ranges where you could practically brew tea in the channel. He had tried rotational grazing. He had fenced cattle away from the most sensitive riparian areas. He had replanted willows by hand, watching most of them get browsed back to stubs or simply fail in soil that no longer held enough moisture to support them. The improvements were modest. The trajectory was still downward. Then he attended a presentation about beavers. The presenter was Dr. Nick Bowes, a fish ecologist from Utah State University who had spent years studying what beaver activity did to stream systems in the Intermountain West. Bowes laid out the mechanism simply. Beaver dams raise the water table. A raised water table keeps meadow soils moist even during drought. Moist soils grow willows. Willows stabilize banks. Stable banks hold streams up on the valley floor instead of letting them cut down into it. The whole system is self-reinforcing, and all of it starts with one animal doing what it cannot stop doing, building dams. Wildy went home and started making calls. The Idaho Department of Fish and Game had a nuisance beaver relocation program. Beavers that were flooding roads or farmland elsewhere in the state could, under the right circumstances, be trapped and moved to suitable habitat rather than killed. Wild applied. He made his case. He waited. When the approval came through, he braced himself for the reaction from his neighbors. It was about what he expected. The politest version of the feedback he received was that he had lost his mind. The less polite versions are not suitable for a family channel. One neighboring rancher told a local reporter that putting beavers in a cattle stream was like inviting termites into your house and calling it pest control. Wild nodded, smiled, and drove out to meet the truck carrying 9 beavers from 2 counties north. 9 beavers and a dying creek. The beavers arrived in live traps in the back of a wildlife agency truck. Moving a wild beaver is not as simple as opening a cage and stepping back. They are heavy, they are strong, and they have teeth that can fell a tree the diameter of a dinner plate. The field team wore thick gloves. Wildy stood at a respectful distance. The first beaver hit the water of Bear Creek and disappeared into the grass along the bank without looking back, which is exactly what a beaver is supposed to do. In the first 2 weeks, almost nothing visible happened. The beavers moved through the riparian corridor, which is the narrow strip of streamside habitat, scouting and feeding and, apparently, arguing among themselves about real estate. Because beavers are territorial and opinionated about dam locations. And this is genuinely funny to watch if you have camera traps set up along the creek, which the research team from Utah State and Boise State did. Then the first dam appeared. It was small, knee-high, maybe 4 feet across, wedged between the root mass of a half-dead cottonwood and a gravel bar that had been there since the last flood cut it loose from the bank. The researchers measured it, photographed it, and added it to their monitoring logs. 3 days later, a second structure appeared 50 meters upstream. Then a third. The beavers were not building randomly. They were reading the creek the way a hydrologist reads a topo map, finding the places where a small amount of material placed precisely would back the most water up the most distance. By the end of the first summer, there were 6 dams on Bear Creek where there had been none. By the following spring, after winter flows had reshaped some structures and the beavers had rebuilt and extended others, the number had grown. The ponds behind the dams were filling. The banks around those ponds were getting wet. And the research team was starting to look at each other with an expression that scientists try very hard not to show in the field because it is not technically rigorous. The expression is, "This is working faster than it should." The engineering nobody ordered here is what a beaver dam actually does, and why it matters beyond just creating a pond that ducks enjoy. Water runs downhill in a hurry. That is its nature, and left to itself, it will find the steepest path and take it, carving deeper and deeper channels, moving faster and faster, delivering everything to the bottom of the watershed in one fast flush that leaves the uplands dry and the downstream areas flooded. This is the fundamental problem with degraded stream systems. They have lost their capacity to slow down. A beaver dam interrupts that equation. The water backs up behind the dam and spreads laterally into the floodplain. That lateral spreading is not just a surface effect. Water pushing sideways into saturated meadow soil begins to percolate downward, recharging the groundwater table beneath the valley floor. And a raised groundwater table does something that no amount of surface irrigation can replicate. It feeds the roots of streamside plants from below, during droughts, continuously, without requiring any rainfall to trigger it. The willows came back on Bear Creek without anyone planting them. This is the detail that stops people when they first hear it. Wild had spent years planting willows by hand and losing most of them to drought stress and grazing. Within 2 seasons of the beaver dams going in, willows were sprouting spontaneously along the saturated margins of the new ponds. The seeds had been in the soil, or drifted in on the wind, or floated downstream from surviving plants upstream. They had always been arriving. They had simply had no moisture to germinate into. The beavers changed that. The willows then did something beavers love almost as much as cottonwoods. They grew. And as they grew, the beavers cut them and wove them into their dams, and the dam grew taller, and more water backed up, and more willows germinated further up the bank. The system fed itself. The researchers from Utah State called it a positive feedback loop. Jay Wild called it the first good news he'd had about that creek in 30 years. Below the dam system, the water running downstream was visibly different, clearer, cooler. The sediment that had been washing off the incised banks was settling behind the dams. The channel downstream was no longer being scoured. In places where the bank had been bare clay, a fringe of grass had begun to stabilize the edge. The creek was knitting itself back together from the inside out, using materials it had always had access to, organized by animals that had been doing this work for 20 million years without needing a permit or an engineering review. The salmon problem. Nobody expected to solve Bear Creek was not supposed to have fish. Steelhead trout, the sea-run rainbow that once filled Idaho's mountain streams in numbers that defy belief, had been absent from the upper Boise River watershed for decades. The combination of water temperature, degraded habitat, downstream irrigation diversions, and sheer loss of the cold, deep pools the fish need to survive had pushed them out of systems like Bear Creek long before anyone thought to document it. The research team was not monitoring for fish at first. Fish were not the point. The point was water retention and drought resilience and groundwater recharge. Fish were something to think about maybe later, maybe never, maybe in a different project with a different grant cycle. Then someone checked the pools behind the beaver dams. Juvenile steelhead were using the slow, cool, deep water behind the structures as thermal refugia, meaning places cold enough during summer heat to keep their metabolism from shutting down. The beavers had not restored the fish population. What they had done was restore the conditions the fish needed to survive the summer, which is the bottleneck that determines whether juveniles make it to adulthood and eventually out to the ocean and back. The fish had found the habitat themselves. Dr. Bowes and his team had already spent years documenting this phenomenon at Bridge Creek in Oregon, where a carefully monitored beaver reintroduction showed juvenile steelhead density increasing dramatically in reaches with active beaver dams compared to those without. The Bear Creek data was adding another data point to a pattern that was becoming very hard to explain away. Water temperature behind the Bear Creek dams dropped measurably compared to the open channel sections above and below. Cold groundwater seeping up through the saturated floodplain soils into the base of the pools was keeping temperatures low even on the hottest August afternoons. This is called hyperhaic exchange, which is a genuinely excellent word that means the mixing of surface water and groundwater through the gravel of a stream bed. And it is one of the mechanisms that makes beaver-influenced streams so fundamentally different from degraded ones. The gravel was alive with cold water moving through it. The fish knew. Fish always know. Wildy drove out to the largest beaver pond on his property and stood at the edge of the water for a long time. He had grown up fishing Bear Creek as a kid and had watched the fishing disappear over his lifetime. He was looking at juvenile steelhead finning in water that his cattle had been wading through 15 years earlier. He did not say much about it in the interviews. He didn't really need to. What the numbers actually said. The monitoring program on Bear Creek generated data across 5 years of drought, which, in the American West in the 2000s and 2010s, is not an unusual amount of time to be in drought. The researchers measured stream flow, water temperature, groundwater depth, channel width, bank stability, riparian vegetation cover, and fish density. They published their findings in collaboration with Utah State University, Boise State University, and the Intermountain West joint venture. And the numbers were stubborn about what they showed. During the worst drought years in the monitoring record, sections of Bear Creek with active beaver activity maintained measurable stream flow. Sections of comparable stream without beavers ran dry. The groundwater table beneath the beaver-influenced reach of the creek was consistently higher than the surrounding unmodified sections, in some measurements by more than a meter. That meter of extra water stored silently underground was available to plant roots all summer. It was the reason the willows kept growing when everything else was dying. The researchers ran their findings through standard hydrological models. The models did not predict outcomes this significant. The models, as models tend to do, were built on assumptions about how degraded stream systems behave, and a degraded stream system with 9 beavers in it simply does not behave the way the models expected. One of the research team members described the experience of watching the field data come in as similar to watching a patient the doctors had given poor odds quietly walk out of the hospital and ask what was for dinner. Flood events told a similarly unexpected story. During high flow periods, the beaver dam complexes on Bear Creek attenuated peak flows downstream, spreading the water laterally into the floodplain and releasing it slowly over days rather than hours. The downstream erosion that had been a chronic problem during spring runoff was measurably reduced. The dams that everyone assumed would wash out in the first big storm were instead performing exactly the function that millions of dollars of engineered retention structures are designed to perform, at a cost of $0 and the caloric output of 9 rodents. There is a version of this story where the engineers arrived and figured out what the beavers had done and then built something better. That version did not happen. The engineers arrived, looked at the data, and started taking notes. The rancher who gave up cattle. This is the part of the story that does not get told often enough. Jay Wild did not just release beavers and step back. He made a harder decision than that. Cattle and beavers are not naturally compatible. Cattle walk into streams and compact the banks. They trample the willows. They destroy the wet margins around beaver ponds by turning them into mud wallows that bear no resemblance to the functioning wetland habitat the beavers are trying to maintain. If the cattle stayed in the riparian corridor, the beavers would be working against a constant headwind of destruction. Wildy understood this. He removed cattle from the streamside corridor on his ranch permanently. That decision has a real dollar value attached to it. Riparian grazing land in Idaho produces forage that would otherwise cost money to replace, or that reduces the number of animals a rancher can run. Wild gave up that forage. He rearranged his operation so that cattle used upland areas away from the creek and were managed carefully to avoid the sensitive riparian zone. He did not receive a large government payment for this decision. He received a smaller conservation easement through the Trout Unlimited Beavers, Willows, and Wetlands program, which helped offset a portion of the cost, but not all of it. He also placed a conservation easement on the riparian corridor itself, which means that no future owner of the ranch can return cattle to the creek bank, cannot drain the beaver ponds, and cannot remove the structures the beavers have built without violating a legally binding agreement that survives any sale of the property. In one signature, Wild protected the creek's recovery not just for his own management tenure, but permanently. This is the detail that conservation biologists talk about when they talk about the Bear Creek story. Releasing beavers is the part that sounds dramatic. Giving up grazing rights forever is the part that actually takes something. Wildy said in one interview, with the directness that tends to characterize ranchers who have made a decision and are done second-guessing it, that the creek now does more for his property's long-term water security than the forage he gave up was worth. He said the springs that feed the upper reach of Bear Creek, which had been declining in output for 20 years, were running stronger since the groundwater table came back up. He said the meadows adjacent to the beaver ponds were greener in August than they had been in his entire adult life. He did not say he had been wrong about everything. He said the beavers knew something he didn't. The model spreading. Across the West Bear Creek was not supposed to become famous. It was a small stream on a private ranch in a county that most Idahoans cannot place on a map without a moment's thought. But the data was real. The results were visible. And the story was the kind that travels. A documentary called The Beaver Believers, directed by Sarah Koenigsberg, had already been building an audience around the broader beaver restoration movement before Bear Creek became a case study. The film followed a loose group of scientists, ranchers, and passionate amateurs who had independently arrived at the same conclusion: that the American West's water crisis was, in substantial part, a beaver problem, and that the solution was as simple and as complicated as putting the engineers back in the creek. The film reached ranchers in Utah who started calling wildlife agencies. It reached water managers in Nevada who started writing beaver-compatible habitat assessments into grazing permits for the first time. It reached a rancher in Colorado who had been watching his stream system decline for 20 years and called the State Division of Wildlife the week after he watched it. The resistance came from predictable directions. Old guard irrigators worried that beaver dams would back water onto their fields. Some water rights attorneys raised concerns about whether a beaver dam could, under Western water law, constitute an interference with a downstream appropriation. These are not frivolous concerns. Western water law is ancient, complicated, and specifically designed around the assumption that water moves in straight lines in the directions humans point it. An animal that builds dams and spreads water sideways into floodplains does not fit neatly into the prior appropriation doctrine, and several states have had to quietly update their regulations to clarify that a beaver going about its business is not violating anyone's water rights. Beaver Management Coordinators, a job title that did not exist in most Western states before 2010, are now employed by fish and wildlife agencies across the region. The Bureau of Land Management began incorporating beaver activity assessments into its rangeland health evaluations. The Natural Resources Conservation Service started offering technical assistance to ranchers interested in creating conditions suitable for beaver reintroduction, which is bureaucratic language for: we will help you make your stream look appealing to an animal that is going to do the expensive work for free. Trout Unlimited's Beavers, Willows, and Wetlands program, which supported Wild's project, has now helped facilitate reintroductions across multiple states. The Methau Beaver Project in Washington state documented dramatic improvements in stream complexity and steelhead habitat following beaver reintroduction on a timeline that mirrored what happened on Bear Creek. The Weber River Basin in Utah showed similar groundwater response. The pattern keeps repeating itself. What the creek teaches us. There is a version of Western water management that has dominated policy for 150 years. It involves dams, diversions, concrete-lined channels, and the fundamental assumption that water is a resource to be captured and controlled. That version has accomplished remarkable things. It has also created a landscape in which the natural infrastructure that made the West's watersheds resilient is almost entirely gone, and the engineered infrastructure that replaced it costs billions of dollars to maintain and fails under exactly the climate conditions that are becoming more common. Bear Creek poses a quiet question to that version of water management. If 9 beavers, in 5 years, on one ranch in southern Idaho, can raise the groundwater table by a meter, bring back juvenile steelhead, stabilize eroding banks, maintain stream flow through multi-year drought, and rebuild riparian vegetation without a budget, a permit, or an environmental impact statement. What does that imply about the scale of what was lost when America trapped out its beavers? The answer, which nobody in the water management world says out loud at conferences but which the data increasingly demands, is that the loss was catastrophic and the replacement has been expensive and inadequate. The engineered West is drying out. The infrastructure is aging. The snowpack is declining. The groundwater is being drawn down faster than it recharges. And the animal that spent 20 million years solving exactly these problems is sitting in relocation cages 2 counties over because somebody's road department filed a nuisance complaint. Federal drought response plans in the American West now mention beavers. That sentence would have sounded absurd at a water management conference in 1990. It does not sound absurd anymore. The Western Governors Association has included beaver-assisted restoration language in its drought resiliency frameworks. The Environmental Protection Agency has cited beaver-influenced stream systems in its guidance on cost-effective watershed restoration. The one thing engineers still cannot replicate is the maintenance. A concrete dam sits in a creek and does not repair itself after a flood. A beaver dam, if the beavers are present and the willows are growing, is rebuilt within days. The system is self-correcting in a way that nothing humans have built comes close to matching. Engineers understand this now. It does not make them entirely comfortable, professionally speaking, to admit that a 40-pound rodent has been outperforming their best designs for longer than recorded history. But the data is the data. J. Wild's Creek is running. The willows are tall. The steelhead are back. The springs are stronger than they have been in a generation. And somewhere in the willow thicket along the bank, a beaver is patching a leak in a dam it built without blueprints, without a budget, and without any particular interest in being told it's impressive. It just does the work. That is the story of Bear Creek, and it is not really a story about beavers. It is a story about what happens when one person is honest enough to admit the land is telling him something, and stubborn enough to actually listen. J. Wild gave up cattle along his creek. He released 9 animals that his neighbors thought were a bad idea. He signed away development rights forever. And the creek gave back something no amount of money could have bought. Leave me a comment. Would you bring beavers back to a stream near you? Or is there a reason you wouldn't? I read everyone. If you are not subscribed yet, this is the sign. We are telling stories like this every week, and the next one involves a dried-out river in the Owens Valley that came back to life in a way that nobody predicted and almost nobody covered.